Hey guys, it's me, the Afro Hamurai. I'm over on the left here. Look, it's me. It's my hand. And I'm going to be talking through the TR-6S and how you can mess with some of its drum sounds. So that's going to be pretty cool. I'm basically going to go through some of the things you can change with ACBs and what those are. Also talk about the FM synth engines and talk about how it works with samples, and maybe have a little bit of an aside that maybe makes it a bit different to the MC 101. At least based off of what I did in terms of like reading and research. But yeah, let's get into it. So I've already picked an empty kit. So I hit kit and then went to just like kit 101 because I just wanted to pick something that I hadn't saved anything into, just so then that way I'm not messing with anything. Now by default, when you select an empty kit, it will use the 808's sounds. So if you switch to an empty kit and it sounds like the 808 kit, you're probably in the right place. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to mess with the snare drum first, because that drum, at least in the 808's kit, compared to the bass drum, tends to have quite a lot going on with it in terms of settings that you can mess with. And yeah, we'll just go straight into it. So the 808 kit in the TR-6S, at least the basic 808 kit, is a ACB based kit. So it doesn't use samples. The TR-6S is actually doing analog modeled synthesis. So it's almost like it's a basically really, really good VST within the TR-6S of the 808's sounds to sound basically the same as what an 808 would do if it's analog. At least that's what I would imagine. I don't have enough money for a real 808, so I would assume that this is exactly the same. And if you want to change how a sound is, you need to select the sound, so tap snare drum, and then you want to use shift and instrument to go into the instrument edit mode. Now, the first two things that you have, tune and decay, are already mapped to these knobs. So if I twist them, my tune's already changing, and I can do the same with decay. So if you're changing these, you don't necessarily need to go into that shift instrument, the instrument edit menu. But it's cool to know that they're there just in case you wanted to. Now with the snare drum, you have something called snappy. Now depending on which ACB tone you're using, or even which FM machine you're using, you're going to have some other bits and pieces show up. So snappy, for example, doesn't show up on the bass drum. Instead, on some of them, it will show things like attack. But yeah, let's have a look and see what snappy sounds like. I'm going to hold shift as well to do a real quick adjustment. Okay, cool. So snappy it's kind of similar to like an attack sort of parameter from the sound of it. Now here you also have level and gain. Level is, volume in a way. And then gain basically lets you set an input gain into the track itself. Now, you might be thinking, well, I can just use the sliders to do it. If I wanted to have the snare drum lower down, I could just put it there and then it'll be all right. What this could be useful for is if you were making an entire project on the TR-6S and you wanted to either send it out as stereo directly to your DAW, or if you wanted to send it in multi-track and you just wanted to make sure that with your multi-track send that everything was already kind of like pre-mixed, then you could use this as a way to do some level of mixing on your TR-6S and have it already prepped out, especially because then that means if you put it up to maximum, that's where you have it mixed, and then you have a really easy way to just turn the track on and off. Kind of cool. I mean, that seems like the sort of thing I would do, but we'll X out of that for now. You also have your option for panning and the amount of sends that you send to the master reverb and master delay. Just to remind you, if you are using this with a DAW with multi-track over USB, the reverb and delay over the entire kit aren't sent on the individual tracks, it's only sent on the stereo track. But now we have effects. So I've referenced it a lot because it's the easiest video for me to reference, but in my last video I did on the TR-6S, I talked about using this with your DAW. And basically, if you have a master effect set up on the entire kit, it won't affect each individual drum sound on the individual channels. But what you can do is you can set individual effects on each drum sound as well. So what generally tends to be my favorite, which is a compressor and drive. And then once I select my effect, I can set my essentially like dry wet level, set individual dry wet levels for the compressor and drive, and then set all of my individual parameters for drive as well. But listening to it even just on, that sounds pretty good. I like that. Now, you might have also seen in the settings for the snare drum that you have the option for LFO. So I'm going to show you that real quick. There we go. And there we are. So you can have an LFO, and basically you can set how much an LFO affects a certain attribute. So, for example, I can set the LFO to affect tune, decay, the level, the panning, the reverb or delay sends, or even the instrument effect by way of its balance, as well as the snappy function. So if you were to set an LFO over the entire kit, you can then map that LFO to separate sounds and how they affect those sounds. So your kit will have one LFO. So the TR-6S doesn't have separate LFOs for everything. Your kit has one LFO, but you can tell that LFO what to adjust on each instrument individually and also by how much individually. So that's pretty cool if you want to do some more sort of like drum sound design. And that realistically should work with all of your sounds. So your ACBs, your FM, and your samples. It would just vary what it is that you can actually control based off of what sound it is that you have loaded. So let's have a look at the FM sounds and see what it is that we can mess with there. So I've selected the low tom. What I'm not going to do is hold shift. I'm just going to press instrument, and that lets me change the instrument. This is where keeping the TR-6S in instrument record or instrument play is essential, because then you can audition your sounds while you go through. Now you'll see in the little window up here that at the moment we have it set on the 808 full tom, and next to the instrument it has a P. That means that it's a preset, but because it doesn't have any other letters, it is an ACB tone, so the analog modeled tone. Now we have a P and an F. What that means is that it's a preset and it's one of the FM synths. Oh, that is tasty. I really like that. That's good. We're having that one. Cool, perfect. So let's do some editing and see what we can mess with here. So we have the same options for LFO, where we can mess with tune, decay, level, pan. And then we also have this morph function. Now on the FM machines, if I don't exit out of things that I need to, you have this morph function that goes from 0 down to minus 128 and then up to 127. And this is what it does. There you go. So from what I understand, and feel free to correct me in the comments, essentially you don't have control over how the FM machine works on a level of setting the volume of each operator, telling each operator and each carrier and each modulator how to work with each other. But you do have sort of like a big macro control in that morph function for each of the different FM sounds that you have in the TR-6S. So you still have a way to control the texture of the sound without necessarily having to use instrument effects or master effects to do so. But much like before, you still have the same effects that you can use on the instruments. So if I wanted to instead, I could use something like a crusher, which I don't really like that much. So we're going to use something else. Oh, saturator. Yeah. Basic, but it's still there. So, shush. Now we're going to go on to samples. I'm going to hit the sample button, but you can also get it from the instrument button. Sample is just an easier way for you to go through everything that is a sample. Just makes it a bit nicer for you to use. But yeah, I'm going to go into sample and I'm going to get one of my CR78 samples. Now here we have a U, which is a user sample. So I have my SD card in the back, and that has some CR78 samples on it, because downside of the TR-6S doesn't have CR78 samples. There we go. Yeah, I found it difficult to find a closed hat just because I found it like it was a bit weird. Yes, a nice CR78 closed hat. So what can we do with the sample now that it's in here? Well, there's two things. First thing, as an aside, if you hit Shift Sample, what that does is it actually lets you edit the sample's information within the TR-6S. So this isn't necessarily the same as the other stuff. This lets you change the name of the sample. So I could call it something a bit nicer than CH underscore CR78 underscore 03. It also lets you change what category it's stored in the samples. So you could put it into, there you go. I could put it into like the CH bit in the samples, and then when I look in CHs, it will be there as a user sample. And you can also edit the start and the end. What happens is that when you exit, it will then write that data if you want to. You can always change it. It doesn't destructively edit the sample. It just tells the TR-6S how to deal with it. Now, I'm not going to change it at the moment because I quite like the CR78 sample, but that is there if you wanted to go a bit further into actually manipulating your samples. Like maybe if you had a long sample and you only really wanted to use it as a sort of like chord chop, you could use that edit sample as a way to mess with it. Otherwise, if you put a long sample in and you play it, it will play that sample for the entire time. So if you have a sample that is, 2 bars long, and you're playing it at the tempo that the TR-6S does, you only really want to put it once as a step in like a 2-part variation, and then it will play for that entire time. Hopefully that made sense. If you want me to talk more about samples, tell me, because that is a bit weird. We'll have a look now. So I've gone into Shift Instrument again, and we have the same thing as before. We have tune, we have decay, but we also have coarse tune. Now this is slightly different. Tune, if I give you an idea of how it sounds like, it's really nice. But tune and decay kind of work as they do with the other instruments, but coarse tune actually gives us a bit of a nicer way to deal with tunes in semitones. So you can go 24 down or 24 up, whereas your tune knob here is a bit more of a fine tune. It's more like, messing in like little cents here and there, basically. So if you're working with something that's a bit more tonal as a sample, you can use coarse tune as a way to start messing with it in terms of like playing it melodically, and then afterwards use tune to just do that little fine tuning here and there. You also have the option for spread. You can tell it what rate to play the sample back at. So if I turn that down, it will play at a certain rate. Changing the rate will change its tune as well, because that's the only way it can slow it down. It doesn't really have the ability to do granular synthesis to slow a sample down like, things like Ableton and stuff do. You also have bit reduce and attack, which are really useful if your sample starts abruptly and then has some sort of like little click in it or something. You can add a little bit of a fade. Just like that. But yeah, with samples, you have a lot more options in terms of messing with it to have the TR-6S play your sample in a certain way. In exactly the same way, you still have your LFO that can affect certain bits and pieces of it, including your tune, decay, your level, your pan, and your sends. You can also have an LFO affect its coarse tuning, and also its stereo spread and its bit reductions. So pretty much everything that you can mess with can be mapped to the LFO. I'm going to make sure that it's on tune as a default just to make sure. But yeah, you can mess with samples still relatively deeply with the TR-6S if you want to, and work with it there. Although, of course, if you're getting the TR-6S and you're mainly working with samples, that's when something like the MC101 would be a bit better, because with the MC101, you're able to put a sample in and actually play it on, tonally a bit nicer, whereas with the TR-6S, it kind of makes more sense if you're using percussive samples or chord stabs that are really kind of in that tone that you want, or relatively easy to coarse tune. Hopefully you found this video useful with the TR-6S. As a side note, As well as TR-6S videos, I have videos of me performing with the TR-6S and using it with my mini log, as well as using it on its own to do some tracks. I'm planning on doing a few more over the next few months, just as sort of like a little, project at home. So definitely check those out and make sure you're subscribed if you want to see them. But yeah, thank you very much for watching and listening, and enjoy the rest of your day. Cool.